All right, everybody. I hope we're all doing well. June, I made you the co-host. Do you have access? Are you all good there?
Yes, you did make me co-host. I did get that.
Awesome. Okay, I'm just gonna do a quick introduction while you get your slides together and stuff. So hello, everyone. As the speaker sets up their slides, I will do a quick introduction to the session. We welcome you to the Education Students' Council Conference Week 2021. My name is Colin Brown, and I will be your moderator for the session today. In February each year, all year one teacher candidates have 1 week of class replaced with 1 week of professional development. This conference week is organized by the Education Students' Council in partnership with the Faculty of Education at Western University. We have 27 sessions this year. This is session number 21. This session is titled Teaching Through Debate and Discussion. We would like to start off by thanking our speaker, Jun Kim, for taking the time from their busy schedule to share their knowledge and expertise with us. You've already read their bio on their CW website, so you guys know who they are. This session will include a 40-minute presentation followed by a 20-minute Q&A discussion. We ask that you please turn your audio and video off for this session on Zoom. During the Q&A, you can type your questions into the chat box, and I can read them to June, or June can read them himself. We'll get to that when we get there. And in case we don't have any questions, we will hand over the session back to our speaker to share any last-minute additional information regarding the topic being discussed. And finally, let's make sure that we each fill up our check for understanding form for each session that you attend at Conference Week this year. You can find this form on the Teacher Candidate Conference Week website under the session description. So if you have any questions, you can contact the organizing team, and I hope we all enjoy the session today. So June, whenever you're ready, you can take over.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So I will share my screen now. I'm actually joined with two of my colleagues today for this presentation. So we'll all do quick introductions of ourselves, and then we'll get started with the presentation. So as Colin so wonderfully put, debating in the classroom and discussion and how that can be, a useful tool for education. So very quickly introducing us, the three speakers. My name is June. I'm currently the president of the Western Debate Society. I've been debating for an incredibly long time, 8 years, and I teach debate myself as well. So I know the ins and outs of teaching debate itself, but I also see some value in, incorporating debating within the classroom itself. So there's a lot of value to be held. There's a lot of discussion that can be a lot more deeper than just a normal question and answer period or any other form of teaching. It is, a unique way to transfer information, let's say, not exclusive to any other forms, but I do think there's inherent value in it. But I will allow my colleagues to introduce themselves. So Tyler or Natalie, whoever would like to go first.
You can go first, Nat.
Okay, hi guys, my name is Natalie, and I am also going to be helping out with the seminar today. I am the current Vice President of Finance at Western Debate Society, and I have been debating for 5 years, and I also teach debate to elementary and high school students as well. And yeah, I'm looking forward to answering any questions you guys have at the end of this.
And my name is Tyler, obviously. Obviously, my training and my education is not formally in, teaching as all of you are. But I do have some experience with tutoring different subjects like English, teaching things, different skill sets like swimming and emergency first aid and stuff like that. But also I work extensively now in the field of, teaching debate to elementary and high school students and incorporating that within their daily lives. So I teach all politics courses as well. And using a lot of the debating techniques has really helped me in getting people to understand those perspectives. I've been debating for a couple of years, and right now I'm leading the training program at the UW Debate Society. And I have some debating achievements, such as being sixth ranked team at the Senior Union IV and top 15 speakers of the Canadian Parliamentary Debate Championships. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about how to incorporate a lot of these skills within your classrooms.
Excellent. So I'll just do a brief overview of what we want to cover today. You can see our website and our Instagram handle at the bottom there. So the session outline, the main takeaways from today, obviously you guys have a lot more expertise in the realm of education. So what we would like to provide to you is some kind of discussion on why debating in and of itself could be a useful tool to integrate to that level or expertise in education. So the big takeaway is the values are mainly to build public speaking skills. Second, to build critical thinking skills. And third, building the confidence of children, but also having a new and maybe a different form of class engagement that some students might like, some students might not like. It's one of those variable things. So today's presentation is in 3 sections. First, how you can prepare your students for debating and what debating even looks like. The second on equity and perspective building. And finally, the third on evaluation and feedback for students and how it can be a evaluative tool, not just one about engagement. So Tyler will be taking it away with the first section. So here he is.
All right, sounds good. So let me just get a timer so I stay on track. 1 second. Okay, awesome. Okay, so first, what is debate? Debating, and usually for the purpose of the debate, typically has to be set out in terms of a binary on a given subject. So obviously, there are many different perspectives that could be explored, but unfortunately, due to just like the structure of like being clear and making sure that students are directly engaging with each other, oftentimes that binary has to be set. So whether you're opposing or for a given motion. This isn't too big of a drawback because I find that you're still able to explore a lot of very nuanced ideas, even within that binary of debating. But just having this allows for a very structured approach to having not only yourself to understand like the topic at hand, but also just makes it very clear to the students what exactly that they should be making arguments for or against. So even if they, disagree perhaps like principally with the stance that they're given, setting up that binary still makes it so that they're very clear in, how they need to do research and how they need to properly engage with that topic when, doing research or whatever else you try to assign to them, on that given topic. So there's like a couple variations of like debating or I guess public speaking and stuff like that. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. So persuasive speeches, class discussion, dramatic monologue. And, these all have varying degrees of like, formality to them. And there's some like more descriptive claims here with regards to how you want to understand them. But I think you guys already get it. So I'm not going to go too much into unpacking every individual one of them. But basically speaking, it's essentially, and all types of like public speaking boil down to it being at least some level of formalized activity in that you're not necessarily just doing it for the sake of talking to each other about ideas, but rather you're trying to have some kind of structure to it, to have some kind of consistency in how people apply that kind of skill in the first place. So whether that be a specific structure to how you want, your students to engage in like persuasive speaking or class discussion, you're still trying to enforce some kind of consistency to which people are able to engage with that on the same kind of like medium. Because oftentimes, at least like what I remember in high school when I was still in high school, is that when you had a very, very informal class discussion, oftentimes people would just kind of talk past each other. It was unclear who was supposed to be speaking next. It was unclear what stance you were supposed to take. So it was very unclear as to, what you would be able to expect as an educator when engaging in those kinds of discussions. So having a formalized and systematized version of some kind of like debating or persuasive speaking, I think is really important for like discussing topics in depth, because especially if you want to talk about how there's a complex issue that you want to explore the nuances of, it actually becomes, if anything, more difficult when you enable everyone to just kind of free ball it themselves and just like have no set structure to it, because oftentimes people just kind of go back and forth between many different types of perspectives that they may have, and it makes it very difficult to explore any single one in depth, because perhaps not everyone thinks that the specific thing that one person is saying is perhaps the most conducive to productive discussion. So setting up that binary and formalizing the activity makes it very clear what the goals of that discussion are. And if anything, it makes it, you kind of force kids, I guess, for lack of better wording, to be very nuanced. They consider a lot of more complex ways of analyzing certain societal issues. So instead of just talking vaguely about like whatever is topical, I guess, in the news, for example, you have people expand very in depth the nuances of the side that they're trying to argue for, even if that's not something that they agree with, perhaps. I think it's still important for the purposes of just like training them to understand perspectives from other sides. And I'll go into like this into like the next slide, which is why using debate as a teaching tool is something that's probably going to be beneficial for you. Essentially, what it encourages is a mastery of a particular topic or an idea, because structuring a debate around, I guess, a binary, or structuring a debate around a very formalized way of engaging with it, basically means that you encourage and incentivize kids to really go in depth into the topic that they're trying to like talk about. So for example, I teach them pre-debate classes as well as like a politics course that isn't directly tied within like competitive debating, but using like debating as a skill to get them to understand these concepts. So for example, political theory or like varying types of like political systems, assigning them a side that even if they disagree with has, what I found, encouraged them to really go into depth to really understand, why people hold this position that I disagree with, or why people really hold the positions, or like the most like prominent positions, like historically speaking. And really understanding like why that's the case, because oftentimes, before I employed that strategy, I found that kids tended to speak very vaguely about these topics within the scope of what, or like within like the limited capacity that they understand them. So forcing them to do this really incentivizes this as well, because it also adds another layer of engagement, because you must respond to opposing arguments. And the gamification of this kind of like process means that you have an incentive to be the best as you can, because you're kind of having that competitive spirit as well within the classroom. So I find it very applicable, especially to like younger students, to keep them engaged as well. So instead of just having a class discussion, I found this is a really fun way for kids to interact with each other too. And I think this is also a very good way to develop your communication skills as well, because oftentimes, and I remember this in high school, is that even within like the higher grades, there was a very big fear of public speaking. And like we'll go into like this a little bit later. I think Natalie or June will. And essentially, there's a lot of people who struggle a lot with communication skills with regards to being clear and efficient in what they're trying to convey, as well as being very unstructured with I guess like how they make their speech, I guess. And the reason why this is important is that oftentimes you have to be wary of what the audience perceives what you're saying is. And oftentimes, especially within class discussion, if it's very unclear as to what you even mean by what you're saying, that tends to lead to a lot of like the talking past each other issues that I mentioned earlier. And it really just like makes discussion a lot more difficult because no one is really on the same page. So formalizing debate as a teaching tool is something that's really effective for making kids very directly engage with each other properly. But also just like as a tertiary benefit, it just boosts like their confidence as well. If you're able to convey an idea that you think is really important to you, or an idea that you've spent, you've spent a lot of time researching on, it's just very conducive to, being confident within the classroom. And I think that's been overall very good for like, at least like my classroom environment, because now, even when you're saying, okay, we're not going to do an activity right now, but let's just talk about, your own thoughts about this given topic. Kids are more likely now to speak up, give their thoughts than if they were not to have engaged in those activities in the first place, because they've had that training of building up the confidence to speak their mind. And finally, just like empathy, curiosity, and open-mindedness. So you must consider and defend opinions that they may not personally hold. And good debating encourages students to oftentimes good debating requires people to think about perspectives from different like marginalized groups who don't really have a platform to voice a lot of their concerns and issues within the status quo. So having people really consider those things has been really beneficial for understanding and being aware of social movements and stuff like that, that I think has been really helpful for me to expand on those ideas more in the classroom, even outside of like when we're doing a formalized debate. Okay, next, preparing students to debate. So I think there's a couple things you need to do. First, obviously, you have to establish a format in the rules. Whether that you just want to have some kind of formalized and structured class discussion, or whether that you want to have a very rigid debating structure that a lot of tournaments tend to do, at the end of the day, you have to have some kind of established format as a starting point so kids understand exactly what the structure of that activity is going to be. So you can customize this to your wish, but oftentimes this includes setting very clear speaker times. So making sure that kids don't go over, like, for example, 5 minutes, or don't go under 3 minutes, for example, is something that's really good. And other rules to account for students' age, experience, time constraints, and stuff like that are also really important as well. You know, how many times you're allowed to speak, what are the order of speeches. Those are really important because I think just reducing the overall anxiety of students is really good for those debates, because it makes it so, you know, they're less just nervous when it happens, but also just like reducing the amount of factors that kids can't control makes it so that they're much more confident in their speaking as well. So for example, if you're just not sure how long you want to be speaking, if you're not sure which role you're going to speak, and if you're not sure what order you're going to speak in, kids tend to get really like nervous about it, because, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty in how that class discussion is going to go. So making sure you establish a clear format is really, really important. And communicating that very clearly is very important as well. Second, on just overcoming public speaking anxiety, because I understand it's very important to be aware of like the different struggles that kids have and the experiences that they have in terms of why they might be more or less hesitant to engage in public speaking in the first place. I know it's a big fear for a lot of people. It was for mine for a while. Basically, you know, the way they do this is have short impromptu speaking exercises, increasing length. So for example, requiring students to like read out loud and stuff like that is less likely to be helpful, because instead of just forming your own ideas and trying to structure them in your own way, just reading out loud tends to be very not conducive to that, because you're just kind of reading off like a piece of paper of someone else's work. You're not really internalizing why, you know, certain, like the sentence structure is the way that it is, what is the most effective way of speaking for yourself, because different people have different speaking styles. So it's better to focus on short impromptu speaking exercises. So for example, maybe saying, you know, what's your opinion on X topic, or like give like a very simple one, like, and this will depend on range as well. Oftentimes, for example, in my pre-debate class with like younger kids, I like to say, you know, what age do you guys think kids should be, you know, allowed to own cell phones, or like whether or not cell phones should be banned in school? And, you know, that impromptu exercise makes it so that they're able to communicate their ideas in their own words and really understand and be comfortable with what their own speaking style is. And I found that it's been really effective to easing them into like the whole process of debating. Okay, second is just share concrete strategies for addressing like the unexpected, losing your place, forgetting your next point. Oftentimes, and like this is a big issue in high school, where like teachers would be really, really like, I guess anal, for lack of better wording, about having to like memorize your speech and recite it and like not have your notes beside you, or else you'll be docked points. It's important to accommodate for a lot of that, because, you know, even in professional debating, we all still use notes to refer to during our speeches, and it's just really effective for organizing them. Obviously, maybe you can put restrictions like don't write out your entire speech word for word, but allowing them to have like cue cards or like, you know, brief speaker notes is really helpful for the purposes of addressing the unexpected time in which, you know, they forget what they say, or forgetting what your next point is, or needing to fill more time and stuff like that because maybe you forgot an important argument that you had, is also really important. So just, I guess, being more accommodating is something that's really important to consider when, you know, using debate as a tool. Finally, just setting time ranges for speeches. So for example, in high school, I remember a lot of people got really, really nervous when an assignment or a rubric, you know, said you have to speak for 4 minutes exactly, or else you'll be docked points, for example. And that was really nerve-wracking to people. So maybe setting a time range of like, obviously you don't want to, you know, have like a little, like a really short speech or a very, very long speech. So setting a time range is really important as well. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Finally, just like learning the formal elements of a speech. So so basically you can give like I guess like a sheet of paper for that, depending on like what the requirements for the speech structure that you want. Basically speaking, it's threefold, I guess. The first is constructive or substantive arguments. So arguments in favor of the thing that you're going to be arguing for or the position that you want. And then secondly, just refutation and rebuttal. So the first is just positive material. It's basically saying why your side is good. And the second is just being more responsive to like other students and like refuting the kinds of constructive arguments that they would bring. And then if you have a speaking order and you're working in teams, you would be rebuilding. So just explaining or expanding on the points that your partner brought. Yeah, and like we can just like go into like a little bit more depth in terms of resources, I think later on. But this is like the general format that speech structure tends to be in. And you can ask questions about that during the Q&A session. Lastly, drafting arguments. So just give them strategies for generating ideas. So listening, considering each stakeholder, identifying different lenses through which to view the topic, giving resources like TED Talks and other kinds of like video essays might be helpful for them to really understand a given perspective on like a topic. And also just like it's good to help it's good to help them in creating like speaking notes and stuff like that as well. These are also things that like, we can give resources on like after the presentation too. And then finally, just like setting expectations for in-debate conduct. Oftentimes kids get very fired up. They get very rude, especially in high school. I remember like the heated classroom debates. So, being very mindful to how students conduct themselves is really important. So emphasizing the need for respectfulness, especially when responding to like other students' arguments. So going like, not going like, oh, well, the point that like the previous speaker brought is just like stupid or something like that is not the kind of conduct that you want to be encouraging. So actively discouraging stuff like that is really important as well, because everyone has different levels of anxiety when engaging in debate. So being mindful of that is really important to ensure that everyone is having a good time and actually, getting the most out of that activity. And finally, just like making arguments about groups of people and no generalizing. That's something that the equity section is going to expand upon. So I'll just hand it off.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Tyler. Apologies for the slides there. There was a little bit of a change in transition, but I'm sure you can have an access to these resources afterwards. So I'm going to talk about equity here and what it means for organizers and participants. So I'm sure you are all familiar with what equity means. I'll just say it again. The broad principle that debate or any activity that you're engaging in should be conducted in a way that both facilitates participation and promotes the well-being of all participants. But what's unique about debating, and as Tyler has explained, the activity or the practice of taking the perspective of someone else or defending a side that you probably might not agree with, right? This level of variability forces students sometimes to be pushed out of their comfort zone and come to realize the perspectives of others. For example, if you're doing a debate about marginalized populations, then students are forced to think about what those marginalized populations must be going through, what their incentives may be. So equity is obviously an important facet of education, but debating is a unique tool in which you can introduce that equity. So how can you do it in this way? And that's what this section is about. I'm going to begin by explaining why equity is important, because one, there are barriers to participation in an activity like debate inherently. Debate is often seen as an elite activity. If you think about the debating team, a lot of people see them as preppy children who have the money to afford debate coaches and whatnot. This isn't necessarily true, but this is still a perspective or a stereotype maybe that exists. But there's also a failure to accommodate for accessibility needs. There is a extra barrier for individuals, especially students who are ESL or EFL, and also some schools may not offer extracurricular debate. So these kinds of discussions are going to be varying levels of comfort for a lot of children and a lot of students. But there's another thing, and there's a vulnerability of participants, because the diversity of all of these students is very great. What that means is you're coming into the classroom with a huge array of perspectives, a huge array of experiences, whether they're shared or not. So what that means is participants may be required to engage with ideas that they might find uncomfortable or objectionable. So the role of the educator in this instance is to balance between making sure that it's an environment that's conducive to proper and constructive discussion, but also making sure that everybody in the classroom feels welcome, but feels comfortable. So it says here, badly chosen topics can cause real harm, and there's no value in platforming hurtful or hateful rhetoric. Harm is almost never intentional, but you can take certain measures to prevent it. So there's a trade-off or a hard balance between the idea of equity and platforming ideas, because a lot of students will say, well, these are just my opinions, and these opinions may be things that are potentially hurtful, harmful, or just alienating for other students. So the role of equity within discussions, the role of equity in debate, all of these things, being able to make sure that you're platforming opinions and platforming students when they're speaking about the topic at hand in a constructive manner, but making sure that you're discouraging any kind of discourse that could be alienating, exclusionary, outright hurtful. All of these things have to be balanced. And the ways you could do this is by choosing the topic very carefully. Even the wording of the topic might matter. Considering different ages, backgrounds, identities, levels of experience, intersectionalities like gender identity, even like sexual identity, or sexual orientation, especially if you're working with high schoolers. All of these things and this intersectionality plays a role into how discussions could exist. So if you believe a topic could invite offensive or hurtful arguments, ask yourself the following questions. 1, are alternative non-offensive arguments readily available? So even if you might not think of a particularly hurtful argument that could be said about a discussion about minorities, that does not necessarily mean that another student might not have something in mind that could be hurtful. Second, even if the topic can theoretically be argued in a non-offensive way, will these arguments be accessible to your students? So sometimes topics might be very, very complex. A lot of students won't know the ins and outs of something like systemic racism. They might not know the ins and outs of gender identity. A lot of male children, especially at younger ages, don't really know the lived experiences of women and gender minorities. And without a proper discussion or a proper environment to promote that kind of discourse, it might be difficult to open their eyes or have them pushed into those kinds of perspectives. So having that discussion, very important. But secondly, making sure that the people that might be part of those intersectionalities feel comfortable, even more important. Thirdly, is there a way to reword the topic to better control the focus of debate? So being specific, saying that today we're going to talk about marginalized populations or visible minorities, and we're going to talk about the best strategies they can use to advocate for themselves. And this seems very broad, but you can narrow it down even more. We will talk about how they can advocate for themselves should they choose to go the route of protests and petitions and legal action, or should they take the route of social media awareness campaigns, trying to spread the word about particular inequalities that exist, right? These are two distinct strategies. Obviously, you could use both, but you can have a discussion on how both strategies could be valuable. So adding detail, always beneficial. Are there ways to reduce the chance that a student makes a hurtful argument? And finally, is the debate the best way to learn about or explore this topic? And as Tyler said, there are some issues or some topics in which the answer is pretty clear, in which you probably should be supporting that piece of legislation. You probably should be supporting one particular side because the other side is forced to defend some inequitable or questionable material if they are forced to. So some touchier subjects like the issue of abortion, the issue of greater rights for women. Probably a debate is not the best way to explore these kinds of topics. So debate is applicable in specific situations. Another slide here on how organizers can promote equitable debate. Consider participants' accessibility needs, including those that may be undisclosed, and how the barriers of participation can be reduced, right? So you can allow electronic note-taking. There's no need that for them to write everything by hand, but also allowing them to do things like use Google as a resource is something that can help alleviate a lot of anxiety for a lot of people who might not think of these ideas very quickly. Also having a very clear protocol in place. What are you going to do in the worst case scenario when a student says something that could be potentially harmful? Having these things in mind, very good to do. You don't want to validate every single perspective. You want to explain why particular perspectives could be harmful, could be hurtful to other groups of people. These kinds of discussions are probably where it's best utilized in terms of notifying students what things are acceptable and what things are not. But one additional point that I'd like to add here is the power of speech and the way individuals use language can really, really be taught through debate. So one very stark example from my experience, and I understand it's just teaching debate exclusively, but it is something that I've noticed, is that a lot of students aren't particular about the wordings that they use. So for example, calling people a drug addict instead of an individual suffering with drug addiction. These are effectively the same things, but one is a much more equitable and much more, let's say, sensitive way of talking about this particular issue. Because calling someone a drug addict in a debate, even if you're talking about should we use safe injection sites. If people are using the term drug addict instead of individuals suffering with drug addiction, there is a level of blame and a level of guilt that people are associating with that individual suffering from drug addiction. Even if we talk about gender, like women and gender minorities, talking about these populations in particular ways and using phrasings to make sure that you're not being alienating and that you're not being, discouraging to these individuals. When you talk about presidents, when you talk about CEOs, when you talk about people in high positions, and this is just kind of a psychology of gender issue, but a lot of individuals will default to male pronouns. They will say president, he, CEO, he. These are all small things that we can correct through the use of public discourse and speech. If you notice your students doing this, make sure they either use neutral pronouns like they, or make sure that they just talk in a way that is inclusive. So promoting equitable debate also means helping children realize the ways they are saying things. And those phrasings are small ways you can contribute to basically a lifelong learning process of being more sensitive about these particular issues. And that is one major way debate can play a role in equity. Awesome. So that is my section on equity, and I will now send it over to Natalie to talk about evaluation and choosing topics.
Okay, thanks, June. So for the next few slides and about the next 10 minutes, I'll be talking to all of you about choosing topics for debate, especially in class. Like what should you look for? What type of topics are appropriate and will actually provide, meaningful discourse? And then also giving feedback to students after debates. How do you do that? And what should you focus on? What should you not focus on in your feedback to make it as constructive as possible? So in terms of choosing topic, as we have kind of already explained, debate is a unique way for students to engage with a lot of difficult and important ideas. So the mere fact that a subject is controversial, however, doesn't make it a good debate, right? So when you're choosing topics, just choosing something that is controversial doesn't necessarily mean it's a good debate, because as June has mentioned, there could be equity reasons behind it. A lot of controversial topics could lead to hurtful rhetoric or hurtful arguments made on other sides. So, kind of having a good idea of what is a good topic is really important, especially as an educator, when you are the one who is going to be choosing the motion and choosing the topic that students are going to be engaging in. So here's kind of like a brief outline of what we would kind of agree as to what good debate topics are. Choose to follow this if you would like to. It's just an outline for you if needed. So good debate topics are, first of all, they're clear. So this means that everyone who reads the motion should have a similar sense of what the debate is supposed to be about. So especially in elementary and high school, you don't really want to have really complex motions that are really difficult to understand, right? You want to have a motion that, even if you're ESL or even if you're, you don't really understand too much about politics or whatever, it's a motion that you will be able to understand, that you'll be able to make arguments about or be able to argue for. So where rewording fails to address, ambiguities, consider including a short clarifying comment or explanation. This is what we call an info slide in debate. So sometimes some motions are very vague or they don't really make sense, such as, maybe you're arguing about a specific medical procedure that not everyone knows about. So in terms of those types of debates, you might want to include an info slide explaining to the students what that medical procedure is, what it looks like, kind of understanding what it is first, so that when they do know what the topic is, they're able to actually engage in it meaningfully. The second thing, it should be balanced. So both sides should have comparable persuasive potential. This is not the same as public opinion being split. So a balanced motion or topic is one where both sides have, equal arguments. There's not one side that is clearly the winner, that is the obvious choice, right? It should be equal for both sides so that students can get a meaningful experience out of this and also think critically. It should be deep, so at least, 3 strong, distinct arguments on each side. It shouldn't be a very shallow debate. And excellent topics allow engagement at different levels. Some arguments are intuitive, while others reveal themselves after a lot more thought and thinking. So it should also be interesting. So especially at the high school and elementary school level, a lot of kids, in order to engage, they need something that is interesting, something that they feel like they can, personally connect with or something. So the more interesting your motion is, students will engage more, right? And they'll actually participate more in those debates relevant to their own lives. Okay, so now in terms of evaluating debates and how you should do that as an educator, based on, what we have kind of thought about. So we obviously are not teachers, and learning objectives may vary significantly. Give me one second. I think, June, I can't really see the slide. So, okay, thank you. So, however, in our experience as debate coaches, teaching students outside of school, we think that students oftentimes make the most significant strides towards becoming clear, persuasive, effective advocates when feedback focuses on, 1, argument development. So this includes, did your students justify their claims? Were their points well analyzed or assertive? Or were they underdeveloped, right? So that when you're evaluating a debate on who wins, you should be really focusing on the argument development aspect. Second, the responsiveness. So did they engage with the other side in good faith, right? Did they respond to other arguments and not, undercut what the other side has said or ignore what the other side has said, right? Were their responses effective? 3, content prioritization. So did they use their limited time to focus on key points of contention? Because as we all know, in a debate, you don't have unlimited time. You do have a time frame. So, did they use their time effectively? Or did they get distracted, right? Did they get distracted by really small issues? Or did they just get distracted by something very minimal that the other side talked about, right? So those are also really important. 4, the organization aspect of their debate. So was their speech logically structured? Was it easy to follow? And lastly, the comparative analysis aspect. So did they demonstrate why their arguments were determinative? For example, why their arguments should win the debate? Did they compare it to the other team's arguments? Those are really great ways. Other things such as, eye contact, volume, demeanor, word choice, speed, and other stylistic choices matter to the extent that they undermine or support the persuasiveness of the student's speech, and should almost never be determinative of a win or loss. So what we notice a lot, especially in the high school, elementary school circuits and debate, is that a lot of educators who don't really know too much about debate end up determining that teams win or lose based on things like speed, or whether or not the student had eye contact, or if they were too loud, if they were too soft. And although these things can contribute effectively to someone's speech and how they present their speech, it should never be the full factor of whether or not a student wins or loses, right? You should never use that as the determinative for a win or loss, because these are things that a lot of people can't control. And these are things that aren't really what we care about when evaluating a debate. We care more about the content and the critical analysis aspect. So not focusing on these things is what we would suggest you to do when evaluating the debates, to make sure that things are as fair as possible and that there's no sort of, biases towards certain students because of little things like this. While assessment metrics in classrooms will not be the same as those on competitive circuits, such as the ones that we're part of, you may find it helpful to review judging manuals for major international competitions. So for example, in high school, there is the World Schools Debate Championships. They have manuals for those. And in university, we have the World University Debate Championships. And there's a lot of judging manuals that, effectively teach judges how to judge debates and how to evaluate them. So if you're new to judging debate and feeling somewhat lost, or if you just want to see something from a different perspective, we highly recommend looking these up and reaching out to these types of manuals. And then lastly, providing feedback to students. So while assessment metrics in classrooms will not be the same as those on competitive circuits, you may find it helpful to review, as I've already said, those judging manuals World School Debate and World Universities. So I've already mentioned that. So some advantages then to providing immediate oral feedback following the debate. So after debates as judges, we tend to always give immediate feedback orally, because the reason is because unlike written assignments and unlike, assignments that you can talk about weeks later, students oftentimes do not retain a record of their work and their memories fade fast. So if I do a debate today, in a week, I probably won't remember really what I actually said, what did I miss, things like that, right, as a student. So it's really great to give oral feedback. You see this all the time at debate competitions. However, it may not be appropriate in all classroom settings. So it's up to the educator, obviously, depending on what type of work you're giving out. But oral feedback is excellent, and it's a great way for students to get feedback immediately while it's still fresh in their memory. And then if you choose to provide, feedback, you should remember to give compliment sandwiches. So, a lot of students are new to debating. A lot of students have insecurities. A lot of students are, have fears of public speaking. So, so sometimes you should consider whether announcing a winner is valuable, especially to younger students, right? So oftentimes in our own teaching, we prefer not to announce a winner when working with younger students, much to their annoyance. But if it's not constructive, or if it doesn't actually provide any value to them, and it will only, discourage them or make them sad, or, convince them that they're not good at public speaking, maybe it's not valuable to do a thing such as announcing a winner, and just give constructive feedback instead. And lastly, if you choose not to announce a winning team, it is still often helpful to provide students with feedback about how each argument fared throughout the debate. So which ones were successfully refuted, which ones became more important than others, and why. And also remember to throw in compliments along the way, right? Remember to tell them what they did good, what you were impressed by, but at the same time, tell them what they can work on, right? So that they are able to get something out of the feedback and out of this activity. So other post-debate feedback options you can include are, classroom votes, so anonymous or a show of hands of the winner or the side that changed your mind the most, if you don't really want to say it's a winner or a loser. Pre and post-debate opinion polls. So, do you agree with a side on a scale of 1 to 10 before and after the debate, to see if anyone really changed their mind after, or if anyone's argument skills were really effective. And personal reflections are excellent, getting students to reflect on what they did well and what they want to improve on for the next time. And so any additional resources that, since this is only a 40-minute seminar, you can go to DebateMate, English Speaking Union, World Schools Debating Championship, Ontario Student Debating Union. This is the union in Ontario that represents all of the high schools that they choose to get involved in after-school debate. World Universities Debating Championships, and Hello Motions is a great website for all the motions that have been set at every single tournament internationally. And so you can get a lot of good ideas from there as to what motions are good, what motions are bad as well.
All right, so that concludes our presentation, just speaking very briefly on how debate can be used as a tool. Understandably, we didn't go into the most absolute depth and the most practical, clear examples of how it may be applied in the classroom. But if anyone had any questions, now would be a great time to ask, because then we can expand on those ideas.
I think I see a question from the chat box. So the question was, in your experience, how young would you say is too young to announce the winner? So June, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So in my personal experience, so this is from teaching classes like over and over again at different age ranges. The grade 6 to 7 range, often it's more valuable to give them feedback rather than a winner or loser. And it's also more valuable to make sure that they are able to expand on their own skills. So I'd say grade 6 or 7 range. But to expand on that even more, I don't think you necessarily need a winner and a loser, even at any level, to be honest. And another very, very excellent tool that I've seen used and I use myself is, instead of having a winner and loser of debate, you just initially set up the students on one side and the other side. You can either tell them to go to the side they personally believe, or you can just assign the sides. And whenever they feel convinced that, something that the other team said convinced them, allow students at any point to cross the room and join the other side, if they feel like they've been convinced by the other side. In this way, it's more of an interactive activity where you're seeing what things are, actually convincing students. You're seeing what things have been widely contested in that debate. And it still provides a level of what is convincing and what is not convincing without explicitly saying there's a winner and loser. Hope that one helps. Our next question, could you share a little bit more about working with students and kids and debating? Do you visit at guests in school classrooms to run debate sessions? Okay, so our personal work in working with students and kids on debating, we teach classes explicitly about learning how to debate and learning the skills of competitive debating, but also learning the skills of public speaking in general. We have done what you've mentioned about visiting school classrooms to run debate sessions, but this has been in the form of helping them coach their own high school debating clubs and stuff like that. I guess that was kind of like a bare bones answer to that question. But there are often situations where, we've gone into classrooms to help them out to run debate sessions. Yes. Next, do you have any good warm-up activities to get students talking? If Nat or Tyler wants to answer any of these, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll just keep going. Some warm-up activities that I've personally really, really enjoyed is starting very simple and something that the kids explicitly will have an opinion on. So this can be as simple as like cats versus dogs, where they will be like, oh, like I like cats, I like dogs, or maybe I like neither. It doesn't have to be that simple though. It could be something like, do you prefer, I don't know, sports versus video games? This might not be a great one, to be honest. But choosing very simple topics that students explicitly will likely have opinions on. Because if you tell them, what are your opinions on, marginalized populations and what should they do for advocacy? No one is really going to say anything at the start. So starting with things that the students are interested in and clearly want to do. And that way, you just ask them explicitly, especially if no one's talking. You call on a student, you go, hi, why did you choose team sports? Why did you choose team video games? Give me a reason. And this kind of introductory level of speaking at something you're comfortable with, right? Students probably know why they like something, if they like cake better than pie or something like that. These are really great ways to get the students to start talking. And it also kind of sets up the debate dichotomy that we're talking about one side versus the other. What is a typical time frame for a debate, researching, and having the debate? So researching takes a while. And when you're using a classroom setting for these kinds of debate topics, I think what has to happen, and like I said in my equity portion, researching a good topic usually has to come to a level of specificity, especially for younger children, so that they know exactly what they're talking about. If you leave it too up in the air and too vague, most of the students won't really know what to say, because they probably won't have an extensive background knowledge on the particular issue that you're talking about. So maybe you could run an entire lesson for the day, whatever you're teaching, whatever subject you are teaching, and that would come with normal preparation of a particular lesson plan. So within that, if there was a specific issue or a specific idea that you wanted to expand on even more, that's where you can incorporate the debate aspect. So let's pretend you were teaching about the Canadian political system, and for some reason also the American political system. Or maybe you wanted to introduce the idea of first past the post in the Canadian electoral system. You could have an open-ended debate specifically about, do you think first past the post is a fair election system? Or should we have proportional democracies or proportional elections? So the amount of research you have to do, you could actually integrate your own lesson planning and just add a level of depth by allowing the students to answer more questions in the debate format. What age is too young to use debates? In my experience, grade 6 and grade 5 to 6 seems to be a kind of a tipping point where a lot of students love to talk at any age, but don't really start forming coherent and long argumentation for minutes. Like maybe they'll say a couple sentences, but like if you expect them to speak for a couple of minutes, that kind of cohesion in my personal experience, isn't really present until like grade 5 or 6. But again, that is my own personal experience. It might differ depending on what group of students you have. But again, debates don't have to be super formalized, 3 minute versus 3 minute. If you do open class discussion, maybe you could even use for younger students. In your experience, what are some of the most interesting topics for debate for a primary junior class? So when we go into the nitty gritty of this, I think one big one that students are not necessarily super excited about, but make for good discussion are issues on like things like politics and introducing very simple concepts. Like here was a bill that was passed about let's say legalizing marijuana. Maybe this isn't for too young groups. If they're too young, maybe that isn't a appropriate discussion point. But also you can introduce a lot of issues within social justice at any age. If you are talking about women's suffrage or something like that, you could expand that discussion and talk about, the women's rights movements or, modern day feminism and stuff like that. That seems to integrate very well with, a social studies or a social studies kind of class. Nat, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just want to say, to add on to that, like a lot of really common debate motions that we see a lot of teachers like to use in schools are, would you mandate school uniforms? And oftentimes kids love those ones because they can really relate to them, right? They just think about whether or not they want to wear one, or do they think it's appropriate, or, the usage of cell phones in class. A lot of those ones, a lot of the ones where basically they can relate to personally are great motions that they will get involved in. But if you get too complex, or you start doing topics that they don't really know about or don't really have any personal examples to relate to, then I think it gets a little out of hand for them.
Yes. Nat brings up a great point. Debates about education itself is also actually really valuable. And one clever trick, I guess, that if you were open to this level of flexibility, is even having a debate about, should we introduce a participation grade to elementary school instead of doing tests and quizzes only, and seeing what your students think and what their opinions are on participation grades or something like that could also be very interesting. Should we use cell phones or technology in classrooms? So there's been a really big trend in teaching debate lately where we talk about online versus in-person classes and what the students prefer for those things. And obviously this comes with a very long pros and cons list. Some students love the convenience of staying home. Some students would rather have the face-to-face interaction. Seeing all of these things are actually also very valuable for you as an educator to get kind of feedback from your students directly. Okay, do you think debates could be valuable in any of the courses offered in schools, or do you think it should be limited to certain classes? So when we go into higher levels, so going all the way up to high school, some classes offered like philosophy, even psychology, history, social studies, especially these kinds of humanities-based courses, absolutely debate is super applicable. In the sciences, in pure mathematics, obviously not as applicable, but in the sciences, even I would argue, when there's like research ethics or, a particular, discovery was made, but what if the discovery is, could go into the wrong hands, right? There's a fun topic where you can talk about artificial intelligence, and the kids love using their creativity on this, and they say, oh, what if the robots take over and stuff like that? So these kinds of topics are pretty fun as well. So I wouldn't say they have to be limited to any classes. Nat, did you want to add in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, from my own experience, when I was taking biology in grade 12, we did a debate on, the usage of CRISPR, or we did, basically genome editing, things like that. A lot of ethical questions in biology and science you can always debate about them. And I also argue that it makes you a better scientist as well, to consider these ethical practicalities as well. And doing it in terms of a debate format really gets you to consider both sides and outweigh the goods over the harms and things like that. So yeah, I think when you get to the upper levels, almost all of the courses offered in schools can have debate be valuable, but some, obviously, like math, cannot.
Excellent. Okay, so the next one, how long is appropriate when giving students time to research their arguments? So one creative thing you can do with debate is actually use it as an evaluative tool, as Nat said in the presentation. And what that means is you can give your lesson talking about the political system or whatever have you, and give them a project, say that next week or due in 2 weeks, whatever the time frame may be, we are going to do an in-class discussion, or we're going to do a formalized debate, and we're going to break it up into teams, whatever you would prefer. And giving them more than just like the day to work on it. So like, think about it for 30 minutes and then we'll have a discussion, often means that they're able to look back at their notes or maybe search up resources online. And giving them this extra time usually helps them in terms of their depth and analytical skills. So if you're looking for understanding, depth, and how much do they really get the content that I taught in this class today, I would suggest giving them more time. But if you're actually leaning towards I want them to be more comfortable with speaking, I want them to build their public speaking skills, their thinking quickly on the spot skills, those kinds of things. For those instances, give them 30 minutes to prepare, 20 minutes to prepare. You can still give them Google as a resource or the web, like using their computers as a resource, but that would be oriented more towards the thinking quickly on your feet and impromptu public speaking kind of thing. So it depends on your outcomes or goals for the class. We've covered topics good for elementary students. Have you had situations where students have said something inappropriate? How do you handle it if so? Yes, this is a big issue. So again, like I said, a lot of students come from a variety of backgrounds. We have no idea what their perspectives are. They might say problematic things. So my personal way of dealing with this is twofold. So the first step I kind of do is try and reiterate the point that they're making and explain why it could be particularly harmful or problematic in the classroom setting, why it is inappropriate, why this might lead to someone being offended or something like that, explaining where that particular perspective could come to hurt someone else, even if it doesn't hurt them, which is a big thing you need to explain. I understand this doesn't hurt you, but here's how it might hurt someone else. Explaining that is the important first step. And the second step in maintaining that equity of the situation is also making sure that the rest of your students feel okay and comfortable after the fact. So again, using it as a learning moment and pointing out why this particular view might be hurtful to another is a good thing to do. But at the same time, you don't want to heavily undermine that student and say, that was a bad take, don't say those things ever again. The wording and the harshness is unnecessary, but rather explaining the background behind it.
Can I add on to that really quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, another thing that I like to do, and building off of like the explaining thing, is that, for example, there sometimes like in like feminist debates, for example, where a kid would like make a very generalizing statement, a very subjective statement about like, what are the role of like X gender within society and stuff like that. I don't want to go too explicit into that. Basically what I would say is like build up like a characterization of the world for them, which is to say that like, okay, let's say you're in this position and let's say you grew up having these values, blah, 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 instilled in you. You were forced to, partake in a very specific type of gender expression. You were blah, 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 blah. And I find that kids, like even at young ages, are still pretty good at empathy. And like they're willing to engage with you in good faith because oftentimes that harm is unintentional. Sometimes, they're taught them by very conservative parents, for example. So building up that world for them and explaining, well, how would you feel in this very specific situation is a really good way to bring them around.
Awesome. Thanks for adding, Tyler. Do you provide an alternative option for students who are very nervous to debate in front of the class? Do you try to pair them up intentionally? So this is a very the good question, because like we said, some students are just not going to be too excited about the debate. Obviously, there are a lot of shy students. And what I would suggest to this, and I know we explicitly said not to just read out loud if when possible, but baby steps, right? For some students, the best way for them to engage and be a part of a discussion is when they know exactly what they're going to say and when they're ready to do it. So in this situation, giving them maybe a week to prepare, a couple days to prepare, and telling students that they can come ready with scripts or they can come ready with paragraphs or whatever they'd like to say. And if they need to, they can just simply read it out loud as necessary. This is a good way to ensure that even shy students might have an ability to engage. But again, you never know, and maybe some students don't want to debate whatsoever. I think that the best way to try and get them to engage is try to give them leading questions. So instead of saying, here's the situation, what is your argument? What is your opinion? Instead of that, ask them personally, what do you think? Let's talk about politics. Personally, what do you think about this particular issue? And try and see if they say nothing, add more leading questions. Okay, if you don't really care about the issue one way or another, do you think it is fair? Do you think it is fair to do first past the post? Yes or no? And at that point, they're at least willing to say yes or no, hopefully. So trying to add them leading questions and trying to get opinions out of them. And then if they say yes or no, you can ask them, why do you think it's unfair? Why do you not think it's unfair? This level of leading question strategy often helps a lot of the nervous students because instead of them having to give a speech or an argument, they're just doing a quick question and answer with the teacher, which might be a little more comfortable for them. Would you interrupt their point to diffuse the situation, or would you wait until they were finished? So I think this varies depending on the severity of the comment. If the comment is outright offensive and should not be completed, as a result, I would interrupt them. But if the comment is actually an opinion that is held by a lot of people, but it could be interpreted as offensive. It could be interpreted as harmful. What you should, it's kind of a very evaluative thing from case by case. If you think it's explicitly hurtful, obviously stop it. If you think that it might not actually be hurtful, maybe even the individuals who are the targets of that statement or opinion, they themselves might not even realize that it is something that is against them, right? So it is just a case-by-case scenario. Make sure that you interrupt them if necessary, but if you don't, make sure that you explain just through the process that we listed. I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the YouTube channel Jubilee, but they have something called Spectrum, when people, strongly agree to strongly disagree. I wonder if you've done something similar with the class, or is this a variation to formal debate? So it is not a variation of formal debate, and I have not explicitly done something like this in a class. What I have done, though, and it's kind of similar, I'd say, is in particular issues, you can have them go from strongly agree, strongly disagree to neutral. So I guess this is a milder version of what you're explaining by only having 3 groups. And basically, some issues you might want to think both sides are valid. You could do a little bit of both, which is where it's valuable to have that third middle ground as a third option. So if you want to have students break into 3 groups based on their personal experience or personal opinion, like, do you fully agree with one side or the other, or do you think we should do a little bit of both? That way, you can have the students walk between the groups if they feel like their minds have changed, or get a good sense of what the students might be thinking. That's a great idea. How can we get these slides? I will share with the moderator today, and hopefully there's some way to give this out to everyone here. Wow, all right. We did manage to get through all the questions. I'm happy that we were able to get through all the questions. I wanted to address as many as possible. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. We are so glad that it has been informative and helpful. And hopefully we see more debate used in the classroom, because we genuinely believe it's a really effective tool for engagement, learning, depth, public speaking, all these kinds of things. But thank you for your attention. We were so happy to be here and for being invited here.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. There's lots of excellent feedback here, tons of questions, just what we like. So June, as you mentioned, I will have access to this recording. It's been recording this whole time, so this will be posted on the teacher candidate website for everybody's disposal as needed. So thank you guys very much, and have a great night, everybody. Enjoy the rest of conference week.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for setting this up, Colin.
Of course. Thanks very much for having us.
Awesome. Have a good day.
All right. Bye now.